यहाँ दिख रहा भाई कितना मज़ा आ रहा है। ठंडी हवा, सामने सूरज, कितना पब्लिक, इंटरेस्टिंग, काफ़ी मज़ा आ रहा होती है, अच्छा लग रहा हो। यहाँ दिख रहा भाई कितना मज़ा आ रहा है। ठंडी हवा, सामने सूरज, कितना पब्लिक, इंटरेस्टिंग, काफ़ी मज़ा आ रहा होती है, अच्छा लग रहा हो। यहाँ दिख रहा भाई कितना मज़ा आ रहा है। ठंडी हवा, सामने सूरज, कितना पब्लिक, इंटरेस्टिंग, काफ़ी मज़ा आ रहा होती है, अच्छा लग रहा हो। यहाँ दिख रहा भाई कितना मज़ा आ रहा है, ठंडी हवा, सामने सूरज, कितना पब्लिक, इंटरेस्टिंग, काफ़ी मज़ा आ रहा होती है, अच्छा लग रहा हो। यहाँ दिख रहा भाई कितना मज़ा आ रहा है, ठंडी हवा, सामने सूरज, कितना पब्लिक, इंटरेस्टिंग, काफ़ी मज़ा आ रहा होती है, अच्छा लग रहा हो।
Hi, good morning everyone, and good afternoon and good evening for those of you who are joining us elsewhere in the world. So my name is Kiu-wai, and I'm an assistant professor of Nanyang Technological University. I'm also a guest curator for Asian Film Archive's Reframe series, The Inhospitable World. So welcome to join us in this online symposium. This symposium is actually part of the Reframe series of the film series, and supplementing the film screenings that are currently taking place in Singapore's Oldham Theatre in Asian Film Archive between now and mid-November. So a really warm welcome to all of you to the Inhospitable World, but to say that would be a little bit ironic because especially when I'm in a mask, but this seems to be a fitting reminder that since 2020 our world has reached an even newer level of inhospitality with the global coronavirus outbreak. And imagine how many of these disposable masks we are using daily in our world. So this program explores the power of cinema to represent, reflect, and envision lives in an unpredictable and increasingly inhospitable world. And from the many ecological crises in the Anthropocene epoch to the environmental injustice experienced by both humans and non-human beings in the world, this program highlights the various types of environmental inhospitalities one could identify in films that represent our world in the past, the present, and the future. So I welcome you to join our conversations today in order to rethink how we can relate and connect during these times of crisis, to orient ourselves in a world of new normalcy and new order. Can we still act, connect and relate in this inhospitable world? And how should we cope with it and envision a more hospitable future? So these will be some of the questions that we'll explore in the 3 panels today. On that note, let me introduce you my symposium co-convener, Dr. So Cairo.
Hi, I'm Kai, and I'm the co-organizer of this online symposium, and I'll be introducing the program that we have today. So today we have 3 panel sessions. Our first session will be starting in a moment after this introduction is Theorizing Asian Cinema in the Inhospitable World. We will be inviting Professor Jennifer Fay and Professor Chia-ju to discuss how Asian cinema offers us a glimpse of hope in a post-catastrophic world full of possibilities. For our second panel at 2 p.m. in Singapore time, we'll be conversing with 4 filmmakers to discuss making film in a time of crisis. The filmmakers joining us are Pratik Vats, director of Ip Aleu, Alex Kuran Kadarli, producer of Mekong 2030, and she's also the festival manager of Luang Prabang Film Festival. We will also be joined by Anasai Keola, the director of The Che Brother, one of the short films as part of Mekong 2030, and Lim Long Yin, the director of Oh Hong Village. For our third and final session at 4 p.m. in Singapore time, we will be discussing the distribution, exhibition, and spectatorship of Asian films in pandemic time. We'll be discussing how film production, distribution, exhibition, and spectatorship has been affected by the inhospitable conditions of our present world. We'll be joined by Professor Gina Marchetti, Associate Professor Maran, and our guest speaker, Sabrina Barsetti, the director of Udin Far East Film Festival. So for this session, we'll be starting our first session in a moment, and with this session, each speaker will be given 25 minutes to present. After that, we'll be having a combined Q&A session with both panelists and myself and Kiu-wai. So don't forget to submit your question in the comment box on Facebook and YouTube, or YouTube, wherever you're watching this, anytime during this panel session. So our first speaker for this morning is Jennifer Fay, a professor of English and chair of cinema and media arts at Vanderbilt University. Her research and teaching are broadly concerned with transatlantic film and media theory, environmental criticism, including critical Anthropocene studies, and the relationship between aesthetics and politics. She's the author, most recently of Inhospitable World, Cinema in the Time of Anthropocene, which is where this film program title got its inspiration from. Her book highlights the history and theory of film to consider how it reflects upon the creation and destruction of human environments and livable worlds. Specifically, the book focuses on examples of film production in which unnatural weather and deadly environments are produced for entertainment, scientific study, and devising military strategy. So let's welcome Professor Fay.
Well, thank you. I want to thank Kiu-wai for conceptualizing and curating this film program, and for the invitation to share some work in the context of how it might intersect with some of the films programmed here, and for also putting me in such great company. And I thank Kai for the great introduction, and Tsai-ju Chang. I'm excited to be on this panel with you. So this is a really a great opportunity, and I'm hoping you can see my PowerPoint. I hope that's visible. There it is. Wonderful. The title of my talk today is Viral Hospitality, Sheltering in the Anthropocene. And it really takes its inspiration from Tsai Ming Liang's film, specifically this film, which is I Don't Want to Sleep Alone, which is part of the series. So I will begin. In April, Arahanti Roy marveled at how the coronavirus had afflicted the world's richest countries, quote, bringing the engine of capitalism to a juggling halt. Perhaps not permanently, but long enough for us to consider alternatives to the unjust and toxic status quo. For Roy, the coronavirus, while deadly and targeting the most vulnerable, is full of revolutionary potential. Quote, historically, pandemics have forced humans to break with the past and imagine their worlds anew. This one is no different. It is a portal, a gateway between one world and the next, unquote. We can either drag our ruined world with us, what she calls or characterizes as the carcasses of our prejudice and hatred, our avarice, our data banks and dead ideas, our dead rivers and smoky skies, or we can walk through lightly, as she says, ready to create a different mode of existence. The pandemic is a pause, an interruption, a rupture, an opening in time and space through which some version of we will pass. And the last two images are just illustrations from the article in Financial Times from Roy's essay. In 1998, Tsai Ming Liang imagined such a similar pandemic and such a portal between worlds as a whole, literally a whole, the whole, as the title of the film is called, between apartments through which antagonisms fester and body fluids flow and even body parts pass through until our heroine is lifted from near death into the light and perhaps love in the apartment above. The pandemic is the cause of social isolation in this film, but what makes the woman's apartment unlivable is not the virus, though she contracts it, nor the hole, though through it her upstairs neighbor both urinates and vomits. It's rather that she's caught between the dark torrential rain outside and the bad plumbing that floods her apartment inside. The government has shut the water off, and yet everywhere it flows out of order. This would be a story of utter post-apocalyptic despair, but here, as in all of Tsai's films, there is still a social world to come, not through a break in the clouds, but through a hole in the ceiling that becomes large enough to fit a body without luggage. Our heroine must leave behind the overwhelming accumulation of paper products littering her apartment, and thus, from the rupture of the virus and the ruin of constant rain, comes at the very end a rapturous slow dance between strangers. So what is viral or catching in this film is not the flu, but hospitality, which compels a character to widen the hole in his apartment floor, transforming the site of ruin into an instrument of neighborly and even world repair. If this is a vision of the future from the past, the whole is a projection for the year 2000, the millennium. Tsai's film in this series, I Don't Want to Sleep Alone, lingers in the contemporary. A migrant worker, a waitress, and a homeless man subsist in the damp and deserted spaces of Kuala Lumpur. Smoke overtakes the city, and the three resolve sexual jealousy and chronic loneliness, and I think also chronic coughing, by falling asleep on a coveted abandoned mattress. In the quiet ecstasy of the closing credit sequence, the mattress serves as a kind of lifeboat in this smoggy, burning world. It floats its sleeping cargo atop the black, brackish waters that have accumulated in the basement of an unfinished construction site, finding new purpose for Kuala Lumpur's halted urban development. Taken together, Roy and Tsai conceptualize epidemiological and climate emergency as what we might call a secular apocalypse. And I want to think about these two terms. First, secular. Secular because the virus and environmental conditions function like supra-political forces against the combined failures of government and the entrenched systems of global capital without any promise of divine justice or the redemption of the good and the faithful. Roy writes that the virus is, quote, that the virus in and of itself holds no moral brief, that was her quote, and it fulfills no particular theosity. Even in Tsai's films, the little miracles, a couple dancing in a ruined apartment, three people sleeping on an improbably buoyant mattress, a butterfly resting on the shoulder of our fishing protagonist, are pointedly mundane fantasies. Fantasies born of this world. The scenarios are apocalyptic in the Greek sense of revelation or uncovering, something that was there all along, such as the failing infrastructures and ineffectual or brutal governmentality and gross class and racial inequalities. It also exposes the permeability of barriers and borders of the state and boundaries of the self. People are vulnerable to the flu, smoke, and general shelterlessness in the world. But these are the same features that make us open to new forms of intimacy, a revelation that geopolitics and notions of sovereign subjectivity may prevent us from perceiving and thus imagining as an alternative future. As Samuel Weber writes, apocalypse is, quote, not simply an uncovering of what has been, but a manifestation of what will be, of what is to come. The apocalypse involves a revelation both of the end of the world and the beginning of another, unquote. Cinema, then, is the profane instrument of apocalyptic vision, and why the medium is so well suited to scenarios in which a new world, including its changing climate, is revealed as latent or hidden in the old. And this is also why cinema can help us to see the slow burn of the Anthropocene as this new geological epoch has been taking hold of the planet. What we once presumed to be the stable norms of weather and climate are becoming increasingly eruptive eventfulness of storms, droughts, and fires. And indeed, in many of Tsai's films, the weather may be more eventful than what we take to be the explicit plot. The background given of climate, typically also the background of cinema, is now foregrounded or revealed as not only the present tense of a diminished habitat, but a forecast for a less welcoming, less predictable Earth. His characters make slow, minimal adjustments and find different modalities and pleasures for what could be, if not a good life, then a life that is, for the time being, in this ruined world, good enough. I don't know if you can see, but there's water all over the floor here. Tsai, in particular, is the filmmaker who helps us to see in the past and present new rituals of hospitality and latent features of the human in a world beset by constant rain, drought, smoke, or simply a state of affairs in which the elements are seemingly out of place. The crumbling structures, the bad plumbing, the waterlogged apartments, and prolificate plastic bags conspire to evict characters from their homes and worlds. And in many cases, these are characters who are already vulnerable, displaced, and homeless. As thematized in Goodbye Dragon Inn, staged in a condemned, haunted Taiwanese movie theater, not even cinema is likely to survive. But as I remarked earlier, these are not films of despair. The makeshift shelters and invitations to share an apartment, a mattress, or a cigarette belong to an already, post-catastrophic world of possibility. So before I say more, I wish to emphasize that this form of sort of secular apocalypse, or this form of apocalyptic thinking, is really distinct from mainstream sort of cli-fi or eco-disaster movies and their attendant effects. And I'm thinking here of films like The Day After Tomorrow or Geostorm, films that kind of give us the world we're familiar with and it's just sudden ruination, or The Road, where the world that we knew is kind of been long destroyed. These are movies that frighten or distress us with the loss of a familiar world and homey habitat. Rather than push us to reorder the status quo, they threaten with scenarios of its withdrawal, creating, if anything, a nostalgia for the present, to borrow Frederick Jameson's phrasing. Or to put this differently, rather than open a portal to a new and hopefully more just world, such dystopic projections produce a panicked recommitment to our world as it is, or as it diegetically was. And they do so usually in the name of tomorrow's children. They're everywhere, these children of tomorrow. Children around whom there's a spark of hope that our current way of life will persist or regenerate. This is a version of what Lee Edelman calls reproductive futurism that resists, even forecloses, a political imaginary. Heteronormativity and sexual reproduction are inherently conservative, he argues, because they seek to, quote, reproduce the past through displacement in the form of the future, unquote, and to use the child as, unquote again, a prop of the secular theology on which our social order rests. It is for the children that we want to keep the world as it is, intact. Emblematic in this regard is the scene from The Road in which the man and his son share a Coke. Making the offering, the man is transported back to the human world that was. Grocery stores full of canned goods, people capable of social interaction, a world he mourns on his son's behalf. The boy, after his sip, is full of carbonated wonder. We know, along with the man, that the Coke can belongs to a diegetic past we already, watching this film, desperately miss. In Tsai's film, such products are just another feature of buoyant trash. So, thematized as a future threat, apocalyptic cinema, we'll go back to apocalypse, manifests in what Ian Kaplan, in her analysis of climate disaster movies, I think compellingly diagnoses as a pre-traumatic stress syndrome. These are symptoms we carry with us, not from the past, but proleptically from the future. In immersive and alarming detail, these eco-disaster movies confront us with a version of a future human subject, some version of ourselves in shattered surroundings, haunted by the loss of the world, while living in a future we contemporaries would like to avoid. While dread of the future is not new, every generation has its scenarios of the future that stress people out. This particular conceptualization of pre-traumatic stress enables us to diagnose how it feels to be living with a pronounced sense of the end, without the promise of a hereafter. Pre-traumatic stress, then, may be the psychological response to the secular apocalypse. Writing of an earlier period and a different scenario of end times, Paul K. Santamor, this is a silly graphic, but I'm going to put it up anyway, has also explored pre-traumatic stress as a signature malady for all people who had been living in nuclear-targeted cities in a time of mutually assured destruction. And that's a scenario, I think, taken from like a made-for-TV movie. This is when nuclear power nations, principally the United States and Soviet Union, had amassed both sufficient weapons and the will to use them such that they could annihilate each other and most of the rest of the world in a matter of hours. The uniqueness of the nuclear global war was the likelihood of total planetary destruction, a remainderless eradication, so geographically and temporally extensive that there would be no after in which to experience trauma. For this reason, total nuclear war can be anticipated and described, but it can't be experienced or remembered. The psychological toll is, Paul K. Santamor writes, collective psychosis of anticipation, what he calls a foreshuddering. In light of a future, no one would survive. To live under constant looming threat as the price we pay for peace, Cold War citizens were afflicted by what Santamor again calls anticipatory mourning. So in the case of post-traumatic stress, or PTSD, the sufferer re-experiences the violent past in the present in the form of nightmares, hallucinations, depression. And the cure, in part, is to make a temporal adjustment by helping the sufferer to place the shocking experience back in the past, where it may be relegated and even bracketed by memory. Once the trauma is reintegrated into history, to personal history, the sufferer can once again live in the present. The only cure for pre-traumatic stress is to liberate the future from our catastrophic ideas about it, to relieve ourselves of the crippling stress of, quote, living towards a future that seems to be written in advance, as Paul K. Santamor writes. In many respects, nuclear criticism, and not just Paul Santamor's, but also the essay on which he draws by Jacques Derrida, entitled "No Apocalypse, Not Now," informs, I think, some of the philosophically inflected writing on the Anthropocene, and it helps us to pinpoint the challenge of psychically and politically managing our political crisis, our planetary crisis. Well, it's a political crisis too. To take just one metric, things we know. The greenhouse gases already unleashed in the environment will continue to warm the planet for thousands of years to come, even if we were to halt all emissions immediately today. No sooner is the Anthropocene discovered and explained that we learn that we are already too late. Srinivasa Ravamudan, reflecting on this connection between nuclear projections and climate anxiety, explains the mode of temporal thinking as catachronism. I'll read it out loud. Similar to anachronism that reimagines the past in terms of the present, catachronism recharacterizes the past and the present in terms of a future proclaimed as determinate, But that is, of course, not yet fully realized. To that extent, catachronism cannot function without the operational assumptions of a theological grasp of time, whereby anticipation, belief, and application on the present are integrated as inexorably leading to a known and inevitable outcome. I want to make this argument that a lot of cli-fi eco-disaster movies are working in this kind of catachronistic register. As such, climate change and so many of its cinematic fictions puts us in the thrall of end times, often with crippling pre-traumatic stress. It also forecloses the future and the possibility of action in the present, which we become inclined to keep as it is. We become nostalgic for our current position or current conditions. Now, the dreaded future of climate change is not the sudden end of the world that we get with the nuclear scenario, or even the sudden end of the world that we get in so much of the cli-fi movies. It is instead the slow erosion of familiar conditions, the gradual withdrawal of an environment that envelops all Holocene life. Slow violence, as Rob Nixon calls it. We are left with either theological anticipation or the melodramatic feeling of belated revelation. Aravamudin urges us against such foreclosure. I quote him, "The Anthropocene is never simply what you predict it will be, otherwise the future would just be an extension of the present. The future still holds some secrets from us, otherwise it would not be the future except in a trivial sense," unquote. So how may cinema help us to help to rescue the future from our trivialization of it? How can it help us to see the climate catastrophe without also promoting pre-traumatic symptoms and the kind of conservative responses to it? Well, answering these questions returns me to Tsai Ming Liang, I think a master auteur for the Anthropocene, the person whose films I think we should be watching. And not only because he features inclement weather and failing infrastructures and epidemiological emergencies. Rather, his queer narrative arcs and long takes, so slow cinema, reveal characters living in a post-human or maybe even post-humanist world. The catastrophe has arrived and its effects are already felt, especially by those living on the economic and social margins of Taipei and Kuala Lumpur. And I Don't Want to Sleep Alone drifts into the last quarter of the film. Tsai does not linger with the environmental devastation at its source, but follows characters who are forced out of, but also freed from the ideas of normative living and its regulating climate and predictable futures. Kuala Lumpur in this film is still feeling the aftershocks of the Asian financial crisis with its derelict building projects and abandoned migrant workers. Repurposed for cinema, this world opens out into free-floating desire and intimacy in the slums and tea shops and half-finished high-rises. And I don't know if you can see this very well. These are two images, one on top of the other, where the rich might have dwelt in this abandoned apartment complex. The migrant worker sets up a temporary shelter, and that's on the bottom. The story centers, and this is just a kind of quick plot thing, on Li Kangsheng, who enacts two speechless roles in the film. One has us playing a homeless day laborer on the bottom, who's beaten early in the film and tenderly nursed back to life by the Bangladeshi migrant worker. As Lee's character regains strength, this homeless character reconnects with the waitress who is full of unspoken sexual longing. She works in a tea shop and also cares for the tea shop owner's invalid son. And this is Lee's other role as the adult comatose son of the tea shop owner. Clothed here in a diaper covered by a sheet, the open-eyed adult son is nursed and masturbated by both his mother and the waitress at the same time. The film is initially structured around these triangles of care and desire, but when the mother has a sexual encounter with the homeless man, played by the same actor who also plays her son, the triangle gives way to a parallelogram of people, none of whom is wholly at home in the world. Even the tea shop owner may be facing eviction, and whose desires stretch far beyond any hetero norms. These attachments and fleeting sexual drives are conveyed through glances and gestures and scenes of care and coercion, through long takes in which bathing, cleaning, arousal, and orgasm unfold in real time. The ambiguity of the narrative is rich. Are some of the scenes sort of the dream of a comatose son? Is this maybe, this is part of this film, his sort of mental projection? Or might the day laborer have a fantasy of constant and total care? They look at each other, of course, through a hole between in the ceiling. Is one part of this film real and the other part a dream? Is there a difference? These are sort of extra linguistic complexities beyond or simply after language as they rise in the body in relation to other bodies. But the film breaks its silence when the smoke breaks the frame. Initially, it overtakes our sleeping subjects like a quiet mist, moving more quickly than people in these otherwise still shots. When we join the scene of Lee in his comatose state, surrounded by his mother and the waitress, seen here, he's enshrouded in plastic and surrounded by electric fans. A radio broadcast provides the official explanation for this atmospheric change. The Malaysian government blames the dangerous smoke on two sources: illegal workers who are incinerating trash in the open, or so they say, and annual forest fires in Indonesia. The government will forgive the Indonesian forest fires, but will certainly prosecute the illegal workers. Listeners are assured that the smoke is not coming from the nearby plantation clearing of Putrajaya, an area close to the city where rubber plantations are being cleared via burning to make space for a new government center. With gas masks and ventilators in short supply, people are encouraged to stay indoors and devise their own protection. So much narrative explanation in an otherwise speechless film. But how else might we account for the world-building activities of new city centers and crops for harvest that render the world unlivable? This is how the apocalypse arrives. And it's from here that Tsai lingers on how exposed people survive. Sex is off the table, the smoke is too much, kissing gives way to coughing, and eventually coughing gives way to sleeping, and sleeping, perhaps, to dreaming. This is no vision of reproductive fecundity where children seed some hope for the future. There are no Coke cans in the offering. The final long take, digitally produced and quietly fantastic, finds our three characters asleep and adrift on a black and lifeless pond. The soundtrack produces a kind of vertical montage or dialectic for a new order. An a cappella song is an ode to love in the language of spring. I want to stay in your arms because you are the only one for me. Winter is gone and spring is here. Bridges are filled with flowers again. Can you hear the canaries sing of love? Descriptions of budding life so at odds with a dark and slumbering image. The melody is a theme from Charlie Chaplin's Limelight, his 1954 film set in London on the eve of World War I. Chaplin plays a washed-up alcoholic entertainer who saves a young dancer from suicide and nurses her back to health. So the theme continues. In one of many pep talks, he declares, "There is something just as inevitable as death, and that's life, 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 life." Tsai's characters, by contrast, are called to the inevitability of sleep, 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 sleep. The title of the film, Ring Under Your Eyes, captures the effects of sleep deprivation as akin to having black eyes. The film, though, is not a wake-up call to the catastrophe of a coming war or environmental destruction. It does not ask us to preserve this world for the next generation, but neither is it an invitation to roll over dead. Instead, the film bids us to sleep, to pause, to consider leaving behind a world that was already unwelcoming to these people, and one we may not want to preserve or carry with us, either into our dreams or beyond the coronavirus portal. As an image of an end, Tsai also offers us a minimal and totally open vision of a future. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jennifer, for this fascinating talk on Tsai Ming Liang's very, very fascinating reading of Tsai Ming Liang's film. Particularly, it resituates us in, back to the present, characterized by these mundane fantasies, as you mentioned, and with the secular apocalypse that you mentioned. So we'll come to a discussion after our second talk. But for the audience, Feel free to make use of the chat box, whether you are using Facebook or YouTube. You can basically type the questions you have for Professor Fei, and then we'll come back to have a discussion after the second talk. So for our second speaker, Professor Chia-ju Chang, so a few words. So Professor Chia-ju Chang is a professor of Chinese at Brooklyn College of CUNY, the City University of New York in the States. Her research interests include Chinese and comparative ecological, literary, cultural, and film studies, animal studies, and also eco-Buddhist studies. She has published extensively in both Chinese and English books and articles, including the Global Imagination of Ecological Communities, and also many articles in peer-reviewed journals and scholarly collections in the States, in China, and also in Taiwan. So she has edited 2 volumes, Chinese Environmental Humanities, Environing at the Margins, published by Palgrave in 2019, and also Eco-Criticism in Taiwan, Identity, Environment, and the Arts, co-edited by Scott Slovic in 2016. She has also guest edited the special issue on animal writing in the Journal of Taiwan Literature Translation Series. And in 2016, she was also the Kiriyama Professor in the Asia Pacific Center at the University of San Francisco. So her presentation for today is titled Women in Pandemic Film, Mimetic, Rivalry, Scapegoating, and Redemption. Without further ado, I'll pass the time to Professor Chang. Yeah, Professor Chang, please.
Okay. Hi, I first want to thank Professor Kiu-wai for getting me on board. And also for Kai for the wonderful introduction. And it's such an honor to be on the same panel with Professor Jennifer Fei. So now I'll begin my presentation. The current COVID pandemic certainly adds to the Anthropocene inhospitable landscape. Not only, but also humanity is a co-shaping force of the pandemic. Next, please. Cinematically, I particularly want to center on the figure of women who are caught in what Hene Zhiha calls mimetic triangle. This talk, in a nutshell, examines how women are configured in this mimetic triangle in the pandemic film. I also discuss how directors' redemptive strategies are offered. So, the bigger framework for the presentation is to examine what contribution cinema can make in time of crisis in tackling, for example, the issue of mimetic triangle and scapegoating. Next, please. Let me define some of the keywords here, including mimetic triangle or rivalry, object of desire, scapegoating, scapegoat mechanism, and finally, redemption. The French humanist Hene Zhiha uses the idea of mimetic rivalry or triangle to explain the relationship between human imitative behavior, desire, and violence. Basically, the theory suggests that mimetic rivals compete for the same object, like 2 boys fighting over a toy, and eventually that leads to violence. And this is where scapegoat mechanism comes in. Scapegoat mechanism provides a harmful solution to this violence. It works by mystifying a marginalized, innocent third party as a scapegoat and blaming all the wrongs on it so as to wash our hands of the situation. In other words, to walk away from a shared responsibility. This type of behavior is intensified in time of crisis. Here, the pandemic and mimetic rivalries and scapegoating run rampant. Doing so fulfills a psychological need to cope with a reality that is out of control. So, for example, people fighting over toilet paper, as you see on the screen, or how politicians continue to attack China, where in fact the fault lies weak crisis management. For Jiha, redemption comes in the moment when the innocent status of scapegoat is revealed, as exemplified in the figure of Jesus Christ. The demystification does not dissolve mimetic triangle, and scapegoat mechanism doesn't vanish in secular modernity. Here, now I offer my main ideas. Next slides, please. First of all, film medium question our conventional assumptions and unchallenged cultural or political unconsciousness and practice of mimetic rivalry and scapegoating. Second, in addition to tackling this mimetic pathology, it also provides alternative and redemptive ways of seeing beyond a triangular mimetic model of relationship. So, follow will be the name of 3 films which share a common theme of mimetic triangle. Women are either scapegoats or mimetic object of desire. And I will discuss the way characters are represented as scapegoats or mimetic object of desire on both narratorial and symbolic. I'll also discuss how directors shed light on different ways of deconstructing or demystifying their identity as scapegoats or object of desire. Next, please. Okay, 3 films will be discussed here. So are Tsai Kiola's The Che Brother from Laos in 2020. Stephen Chow's Hong Kong, A Winner, Hong Kong is from Hong Kong in 2003. And finally, Steven Soderbergh's Contagion from the US in 2011. Next, please. During the COVID pandemic, there emerged some pronounced mimetic behaviors. One of them was a rise up the streaming charts of realist films about fictional pandemics, particularly during the early stage of the COVID lockdown. According to psychoanalytic film scholar Robert Gill, binging pandemic film is a response to the crisis as a way for the Cartesian self or ego to cope with uncertainty of the crisis. Watching pandemic films assert control over reality. Binging outbreak films is this, as compared to other behaviors such as burning cell phone towers, engulfing on strangers. During the first few months of the outbreak in the West, we observed a rise in hate crimes. One of the dangerous one is mimetic scapegoating. For example, during the first few months, we observe xenophobic hate crimes. Asians or Chinese Americans in the U.S. were subjected to racial slurs and violence. For example, in New York City, an acid fluid was poured on Asian women, and my Chinese students was called coronavirus, and I was even stalked by a stranger. Cyberbullying increased by 900%. Next, please. Not only are culturally marginalized minorities becomes easy targets to blame for the crisis, so are particularly wives and mothers. This is seen when coronavirus was used to excuse the increased male domestic violence during the lockdown, blaming the violence against women on job loss and stress. So now let me turn to the films. Next, please. The first film is Hong Kong, A Winner. Like the one that is selected in this Reframe film series, Memories of the Spring, it belongs to a film project launched by the Federation of Hong Kong Film Workers in 2003. It consists of 12 one-minute film shorts packaged entitled 1 to 99, referring to the bleach to water ratio recommended by health officials as a as an anti-SARS disinfectant. The goal of this project is to boost the morale of Lawson and strengthen civic pride. Next, please. This film tells a story about a mother who is hospitalized in an isolate due to SARS. Through the telecommunication, she stayed in touch with her family, and we see her comforting her daughter via video conference. The whole family seemed distressed over whether or not she will recover, a very common misery in the age of pandemic. The reversal comes when the reveal that the daughter is playing mahjong against her brother and father, that the mother in the sickbed is teaching the daughter how to win. And next, please. The director employs a pro-feminist auto-ethnographic strategy to subvert the conventional pandemic narrative. First, it subverts women as scapegoat who must make the ultimate sacrifice for absolving the sin of her patriarchal community. Here, the sick mother transforms into a wisdom giver, transmitting knowledge to her daughter, as dramatized in the form of secular mahjong playing to combat patriarchy represented by the father-son dyad. Taking the figure of the mother as a trope for Hong Kong, the autoethnography challenged the historical Western pandemic narrative, where Hong Kong and the Hong Kongers are positioned as the cultural other, to be scapegoated for the pandemic. Finally, the director also subverts the negative association with quarantine by reinterpreting it as a site of connection rather than isolation. Here, shelter in place and mother's hospitalization offer an opportunity for family bonding. Next, please. The next film is I want to talk about is Contagion, and I apologize I was not able to secure this to show the of all these three. Well, at least the two films, and the last film is it's in the program. So I encourage everybody to see the Chia brother. Okay, Contagion is a pandemic that begins with patient zero, Beth Enhoff, a white woman business representative who works for an international development company, brings a infectious disease from China to the West and dies. On her way back to Minnesota, Beth meets with a former lover during the Chicago layover. She dies 2 days after returning home to Minneapolis. So does her son, and pandemic begins. And this film is probably the most watched film during the. Next, please. While the blame is directed towards China, as the film designates Hong Kong as the origin of the pandemic, possibly a reference to SARS. But on a more subtle level, as a Hollywood film, it offers another scapegoat, Beth. So this film renders two scapegoating lines, one around ethnic and animal other, and the other around women. Is an unfaithful woman who causes her son's death, brings potential STD to her husband, and pandemic to her community. As horrific as Patient Zero reflect deep ingrained sexism within Hollywood, which is translated as patriarchal anxiety and fear of women's infidelity. Hollywood continues to be problematic for women, whether it is obvious abuse of a Harvey Weinstein or or even unconscious vilification, as in this film. Even though the director did not intend it this way, but on the level of political or cultural unconsciousness, Beth in Contagion ends up being the scapegoat for the pandemic and dies a horrible death. Next, please. On a narratorial level, Beth's death brings a closure of any possible redemption. However, I think that the film on a formal level provides a non-narratorial or posthumous redemption. This is notably exemplified at the very end of the film. This final scene is a silent flashback of day one. Here we see a bulldozer owned by a Western company that Beth works for tramping down the trees in a remote village in Asia. The bulldozer disturbed a virus-bearing bat biting a piece of banana from a banana tree. The bat flies over to a nearby pig pen and accidentally drops a piece of banana from its mouth to the ground. The banana then swallowed by a piglet, hence transmitting the virus to the pig, which is sold to a restaurant and prepared by a chef. And the chef is called upon to greet the customers. Without washing his hands, the chef shakes hands with Beth, therefore transmitting the virus to her, and this is how she becomes patient zero. So what this film shows that though Beth may be blamed for being the one who brings the disease to the West, but she was just one of the many factors in the network of causes and effects. Next, please. Before I give a nod to the last scene as a visual illustration of a non-mimetic Latourian network way of seeing a pandemic event, I shall first point out yet another political unconsciousness in Hollywood, in addition to sexism I previously discussed. The image of the chef and Beth standing together plays into a stereotypical Orientalist trope of Chinamen, short, fat, and unhygienic, vis-a-vis a Western woman, blonde, tall, and beautiful. Despite this racist version of China as yellow peril, which is part of the causal chain or network to the pandemic. Having said this ending nonetheless offers a reassessment beyond the scope of scapegoating narration. Next, please. Sequence reject a reductive or single cause view of the plague and gestures at a more complex view to account for the emergence of the pandemic. The overall diffused geographic spatial representation of pandemic spread provides a clue to the network distribution of cause, agency, and in which issues of viral communicability, wildlife habitat loss, animal farming, urbanization, international cooperation, global consumerism, and transportation networks such as air travel industry, even human physiology and behaviors of coughing and touching things are interlinked. All of these are responsible for the transmission of the disease and cannot be reduced to one or two factors such as patient zero, a certain ethnic group, or non-human species. Next, please. The last film I want to discuss is Anisai Keola's The Che Brother. Set in 2030, during a pandemic, it tells the story of a young Vietnamese urbanite and Che Guevara enthusiast who returned to his rural hometown, only to find himself caught in a dispute between his brother and sister over the ownership of their unconscious sick mother. It turns out that their mother has a rare antibody, which is very profitable as a cure for an ongoing pandemic. His sister accuses his brother of selling their elderly mother's blood to Western pharmaceutical companies and persuade him to help her to bring her back. After he succeeds, he finds out that his sister is far from innocent. She also engaged in the same business. Next, please. This film is part of the Mekong 2030 film anthology project, which envisions the future of Mekong River, the longest river in Southeast Asia. The future of this vital river is endangered due to the construction of massive dams by the collective efforts of governments such as China and Thailand, and transnational developers and financiers. Next, please. Given the very name of Mekong is associated with Mother Nature, as Mei Lan in Thai and Lao means Mother of Nature, an ecofeminist analysis helps flesh out the symbolic relation between the Sikh Mother and Mekong River. In the film, we see an intense mimetic rivalry between elderly siblings over an object of desire that is their mother's blood. On a literal level, the siblings are committing slow matricide, holding her captive in a makeshift hospital, and using her blood as a money-making machine. Symbolically, the Sikh mother represents the Mekong as mother river on which local people's livelihood depends. The needles and tubes attached to her and the bottles around her represent the technologies that intercept the river's water state of depletion for producing hydroelectric power for foreign consumption. Laos has a self-described goal to become Asia's battery. The Tsai brothers established a correlation between woman's body and nature as seen in the juxtaposition of the personal mother and mother river in one frame, as you can see on top of the screen. Here, extraction of third world women's body and water are linguistically linked, contextualized, and visually linked. Next. In critiquing the vaccine or hydroelectric market's exploitation of women and nature, the director holds the urban middle class accountable by exposing their hypocrisy or complicity. As in Tsai-inspired revolutionary, the protagonist's intervention is later challenged by his sister, who reminds him of his indirect complicity via his college education, urban lifestyle, which was supported by the money his sister made from the dirty business. This demystification or revelation, how his mother becomes an object of desire, catalyzed the Tsai brothers' consciousness transformation. This change is seen in the repeated expression of a reverent gesture, first to his own mother and then to the river. Though the vision for the future of the mother river at the end of the film is ambivalent, we can nonetheless see some hope of redemption, suggested in the smile of the Tsai brother. His submersion into river can be read as a rite of passage into a new self, accompanied by the tossing away his beret and the gun as a form of renunciation of his current superficial identity as a middle-class revolutionary who is completely alienated from Mother Nature. Next, please. So here, let me quickly compare and these three films. Here we have a SARS promotional film from Hong Kong, a Hollywood film, and one indie Kai-Fi from Laos. The mother in Hong Kong, the winner, can be interpreted as a scapegoat who must be exorcised to cleanse the sin from her community. While the Hong Kong mother was redeemed and integrated into her community through a self-narration or autoethnography that is punctuated with comic reversal. Beth's scapegoat status remained ambiguous, though one may interpret a retrospective flashback that exposes the multi-causality of the pandemic as posthumous redemption. The Tsai brother, the elderly ruder or working class mother, remains to be a commodified object of desire throughout the film. Her redemption relies on her child's awakening of his own unwitting complicity that leads to a genuine consciousness change and action. Next, please. And here I come to my conclusion. During the pandemic crisis, what we see is an intensified, almost contagious behavior of blaming, which uncannily resembles the spread of virus. Blaming and scapegoating mirrors the replication and transmission of virus, but in this case, for the preservation of the Cartesian self. So, what role can film play in times of pandemic crisis? My answer is that film medium can serve as a critical platform to tackle the problems, such as one discussed in this presentation. It questions our conventional assumptions and unchallenged cultural, political unconsciousness and identity, redressed narrow views of complexity to single picture. Film medium being alternative non-mimetic solutions and affect, such compassion, a state in the Latin root, compassion means co-suffering. The redeemed meaning of co-suffering recognize our own vulnerability. We cannot be denied to others. Though the length of this cinematic aesthetic relationality and affect of compassion, renewed understanding beyond man triangle, with a realization that we are dependent, co-suffer, co-perish, and co-flourish. Through cinema, we gain non-reductive and non-dualistic knowledge about our solidarity. And this solidarity arrive at a different understanding of we are all in. It also an income in the inhospitable pandemic landscape. That is part of the problem, and we need consciousness to fix our unwitting ignorance, biases, and complicity, like the Tsai brother. There is no individuated subject standing out, excluding himself or herself among winners or losers in this planetary togetherness and co-suffering. And this serves as a basis for imagining new form of interconnectivity and ethics. Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Professor Chang, for such a wonderful presentation and analysis, particularly drawing these important issues in how female and ethnic minorities have been scapegoated, and the eco-feminist readings, which there are a lot that we can definitely discuss. So please let me remind everybody that that are watching our live to make use of the chat box, whether you are with us on YouTube or Facebook. Send us your questions, and we'll come to the Q&A session now. So feel free to raise your question to either of the presenters or both of them. So to take the liberty to perhaps ask the first question. There are really a lot going on, and I'm really excited to engage in the discussion in all these different aspects, from gender to ethnic issues, and also on aesthetics and the temporality of films. And since both of you have written extensively on eco-cinema and films that are related to the Anthropocene, and particularly focusing on climate and ecological issues. So, but for the presentations today, as we can see, there is a major focus that are placed on the pandemic issues that are perhaps seen in, say, like Tsai Ming Liang's The Whole, and also in Chia-ju's discussion of the three films. So, do you think that the Anthropocene discourse is now quite heavily shaped, significantly shaped by the pandemic, and because of this past year, particularly in the study of films? Yeah, so that's a first question I have in mind, and for both of you, I think. And then, do you have any?
Maybe they can answer first, and then Maybe Jennifer, would you like to go first?
Sure. I really enjoyed. I have a little weird echo, but I'll try to talk through it. I really enjoyed Tsai-ju's the way I think I'd forgotten the ending of Soderbergh's film. That after he has us so tied to like Gwyneth Paltrow and all of these other famous people, it's like such a panoply of like famous people of Hollywood who are acting in this movie, and we're wondering which of these people are going to die. That at the very end of the film, we come to the realization that this film could have been about so many other things, but only belatedly. That it could have been a film about deforestation. It could have been a film about the corporations that are behind this. Like it could have been a film about the Anthropocene, but it turned out to be a film about a pandemic. And I think that's a really interesting way of thinking about all of the films that you were focusing on. Mm-hmm. So I think there are ways in which the Anthropocene helps us to think about the pandemic, but I would almost want to reverse it to say the pandemic helps us to think differently about the Anthropocene, insofar as that the human vector, which moves us between animals and, let's call it the kind of second nature in which most of them are living these days, and an unnatural habitat, which we might call the Anthropocene, come together in the way the pandemic spreads, particularly now through, as you know, I think again, Chia-ju, you noticed like things like, global travel. I mean, all of these things that are these kind of metrics of the Anthropocene starting in 1945. I mean, the pandemic really surfaces. So I guess what I would say is what these films, and I think your Luturian sense of like that networked actance out there in the world, the pandemic brings the Anthropocene into focus, maybe even more than the pandemic brings the Anthropocene into focus, if that makes sense.
Can I speak now? Yeah. Well, thank you for the the feedback of Jennifer of my presentation, and I think that yes, I agree with you. I think pandemic is a very good way of reassess or rethink the Anthropocene, and as an eco-critic, I have been using a lot of eco-critical theories like, the Lawrence Bill, slow violence, and, and all this. And there is a sense of, we are in the age of the Anthropocene, then the discourse, sort of the moment of apocalypse, right? So the older humanist way of thinking is no longer applied. So there is a sense of the Anthropocene sort of punctuate the birth of a new era, right? We totally break from the Holocene, for example. But the pandemic actually pulled me back to think that, we are not totally away from our very ancient problem. The virus, the plague, right? So this is this really not that new? I mean, think about it. Well, technology, the way we deal with it might be new, but plague has always been there, and virus is probably one of the oldest sort of, to think about. And anyway, so I like to use this opportunity to think about the usefulness of traditional humanist scholarship. That's why I wanted to use someone like René Girard. Like people, we probably no longer don't want to talk about him anymore because we are in a new era, right? So we have to use a new theory, new way of conceptualize it. But I feel like this is a perfect place to talk about scapegoat, right? And blaming others. And there's a sense of continuation, right? We have new problems. But the new problem is built on the old problems that we have as human, from our civilization, from our culture, and probably even building our DNA. The research shows that the humans sort of scapegoating. You can find that even in monkeys, in primates. It has the neurological root, and the mimetic behavior. This is how we have education, and what makes we learn is a foundation of civilization. But how do we deal with this negative aspect of mimetic rivalry? The tendency to scapegoat, and when we our sense of self feels threatened, right? So I guess, yes, Jennifer, I agree with you. This pandemic is such a wonderful way of us to think about future, also to think about future Anthropocene crisis, like climate change. How it's a very good way to see how people respond, right? And how do we can better sort of to conceptualize and see how film can address and tackle the problem, and film aesthetics. And not only the film narrative actually addressed this issue, and film aesthetics probably helped, like the last scene of Contagion, for example. Special editing, visual editing, and all that, the editing montage of different images of the woman touching, right? You see a lot of touching, and all of this actually make you realize, oh, okay, so this is pandemic is not just, you cannot reduce it to that chef or to Beth herself, right? So yes.
Yeah, interconnectedness. But the one point that Chia-ju, you mentioned about thinking about the future, which kind of leads me to think about the temporality and also the issues that Jennifer has also mentioned in her talk, because it gives me a feeling that Jennifer's talk has actually quite heavily focuses back at the present. Yeah, I'm not sure with rather perhaps a little critical perspective towards like sci-fi and also speculative fictions, eco-disaster films, etc. So a lot of these makes me wonder whether perhaps it is actually quite important for us to actually focus in the future, in the present. And with that in mind, it also leads me to think about the concept of solastalgia, which I think Jennifer is talking about something quite similar when you talk about the pre-traumatic stress syndrome, which perhaps is something that we can discuss as well in terms of how we actually should should we actually like focus more on predicting and imagining the future, or whether there are actually quite a lot that we can reflect upon on films that are actually about reality at present. Yeah, so that's something that kind of triggered me to think further. Yeah.
Shall I respond? I want to maybe pick up, Chia-ju, something that you said about kind of something that maybe old-fashioned humanism can still teach us, and that is this is not Latour. This is not sort of actor network theory. It's not object-oriented ontology. I'm moving in a very different direction to concepts of politics and freedom, and I think what's interesting to me is the way that, I really like Ian Kaplan's book in terms of how, she's sort of thinking about the fact that there is a kind of sense of kind of already kind of a collective mourning over this future that we're predicting as which makes us want to kind of cling to the present. And I think this is also something that certain modes of sustainability, I think sometimes, are also about kind of keeping things as they are, and sustaining them, forever in perpetuity or something like that. But when we, I feel like one of the things that's so crippling about Anthropocene projections and thinking in geological scales is a sense of a certain kind of, temperature of the climate, rising ocean levels that are going to happen, but a sense that kind of future is already, as you might say in the stratigraphic geological sense, already written in stone. That layer is already there. That future is already unfolding. And it's one thing to think about this in a geological scale, but what happens when that sense of a future that is already somewhat predicted, or something that we can already kind of fathom, then starts to foreclose a sense of like politics, which is so predicated on questions of freedom, of a future that is still open. And I mean, this is very old-fashioned, but I feel like, you know, I've been reading up some Hannah Arendt lately, and I'm interested in like what is the possibility for something like action within the discourse of, or at least the humanist discourse of the Anthropocene. And when cli-fi and eco-disaster movies are just sort of projecting this future that is that makes us want to be in this world as it is forever, or be terrified of the future that we think is set, then it does kind of shut down what is not determined as a kind of future. So I guess that's one thing. And then, you know, there's also a way in which, I mean, I think I would love to hear other people on this, on how, like in particular, Tsai Ming Liang, but well, in particular in his films, how nostalgia is working. I'm thinking of all of the musical numbers, or even in like The Whole, you know, you have these musical numbers, but it's not really for a past we can locate ourselves in. It's not a past we would necessarily even want to return to. It's like this almost like Benjaminian eruption of something, of some other kind of temporality in the present, that was never available in the past. So I don't really have a great answer to the question of how we sort of reconcile the nostalgia, but I think the nostalgia is not a longing to return. I guess maybe with Svetlana Boym, one might even think of like a kind of dissident nostalgia, that maybe what produces the kind of crumbling infrastructures, the dispossession, the homelessness that I think is all over Tsai's films, comes from a past we wouldn't want to return to, and a home that is always already evicting us. And so I think there's a kind of, you might say, a kind of politically dissident nostalgia that underwrites this as the home that should be changed, that we shouldn't want to restore, that we might want to or have to leave, or maybe that the ruination of the home is necessary. And I think that is such an interesting feature of The Whole, that one has to destroy the apartment, soil what's below. I mean, all of this kind of, you know, funny body fluid humor. But that becomes the condition by which something new can happen. So the nostalgia, if we want to think about it as like literally an interest in a return to home, I don't necessarily see it in Tsai's films, although I think his relationship to the past is a very complicated one. And music plays such an important role, that music can transport us and carry the burden of forms of narration and feeling, and relieve the human actors of some of those burdens. So those are two features. Like, one is to sort of think about the future as being open in order to sort of preserve some sense of politics, which is itself is predicated on some version of freedom, but also a nostalgia that I think is maybe more dissident, at least in his films, than it is this desire to preserve the home as a place for return.
Okay, how to reconcile nostalgia? I'd like to raise the issue of intergenerational differences. You know, I suspect that this whole collective nostalgia is probably our generation, like people probably above 40, I don't know, I'm just guessing. I wonder if the younger generation share the same sentiment of nostalgia. And I have anecdotal evidence for that from my own experience of teaching, where, you know, as an eco-critic teaching, you know, eco-critical theory, we talk about nostalgia, and I would sometimes, you know, make reference to my childhood river that is clean, you know, this kind of the image of the pristine nature, you know, saying, oh, we're still catching fish in the river, you know, now all the river is polluted. So I have a sense of, oh, your world sucks, right? My world is better than yours. And my students, they are protesting. They raise their hands saying, why should I be nostalgic for your past? I have never seen a clean river. I grew up in Brooklyn. And I was surrounded by all the cement, and I'm quite happy with my cell phone, right? I'm quite happy with living in my digital, virtual reality. I don't want to live in the real reality. So there is I start to feel this kind of sort of gap, generational gap when we talk about nostalgia and my sense that the younger generation, they are probably born, with cell phone, like into the world. They literally born into the world where, it's like a Truman Show, right? They're already born in the virtual reality. So they have a second nature, right, to live in. So it's very different from our world, the pre-email time, right? So and I noticed that we have this sense of apocalypse, say worry about, the viral sort of the contagiousness of social media that is actually polluting our political environment, landscape, and all that. But I feel the younger generation seems to be very optimistic about technology. Like they're very technophilic. They believe in science and technology can save our world. And every year there's a new medicine, new things come out. So they are very hopeful, actually. I seldom see a sort of a pessimistic younger. The pessimism seems to come from the sort of older humanist sort of tradition. At least that's my observation. So how to communicate with the younger generation rather than staying with the discussion with people from the same age group where we share same collective memory, right? Like Tsai Ming Liang, right? So we, and also the class differences, right? The class division that the Tsai Ming Liang's film that was dealing with this, perhaps the blue collar working class people and the middle class sort of collective sensibility is also very different. And I feel that, I don't know, Jennifer, I don't know if I'm correct, that there is a difference between, well, at least there's an Australian psychologist, I forgot his name right now. He came up with the term called solastalgia. Okay. He said that based on his sort of clinical sort of observation, those patients who actually, they are environmental refugees, right? After the storm or whatever, their home was destroyed. The way they describe the missing home while at home, it's not really quite nostalgia like the one we see in Al Gore's Inconvenient Truth, where he was reminiscing, his beautiful childhood, like me, right? The pristine nature, right? When he was a boy. But it's like, I miss home. I miss my home. Why I'm home? And you see that in Chai Jing's Under the Dome. When Chai Jing was sort of lamenting about 4 seasons, right? In Beijing, you don't have that kind of season. Every day is gray. Okay, so I don't know if people like Ian Captain or they actually make that kind of distinction of nostalgia. I feel like nostalgia is sort of older generation. You have a pristine nature to fall back to, right? Where nostalgia is dealing with the present, and I miss the safetyness, the hospitable comfortness, or hominess of the present. So that's just some of my observations.
One word about, the concept of solastalgia by Glenn Albright, the Australian psychologist, that actually makes me think about Mekong 2030, because we are seeing quite a number of these films which actually projects to the future, the near future, and I guess that also quite a lot of these filmmakers are young, of a younger generation whose films kind of actually addresses this sense of solastalgia, which you just mentioned, and perhaps that may be the generational difference that you've just mentioned. Perhaps for the younger generation, nostalgia may not be a thing that is more significant than like this sense of the fear of becoming homeless when one is still at one's home. Yeah. So I guess, yeah, perhaps that may be something we can think about as well. But
yeah, so we have a question from the audience, and I thought maybe we can now try to bring it out from academia a little bit, because we do have many audiences who are not in academia. So to break it down a little bit more,
Okay.
so we have Chuck. Hi, Chuck. I think he's a filmmaker from Korea, and he thanks you for the wonderful speech and your insights. And he's wondering what the expectations of the filmmakers and their work based on on your analysis, and if you have any messages or recommendations for creators out there. And I thought that I would add on to that question as well. You know, and I think it's related to this question too. It's what do you think are the impacts of using films, the impact to audiences of using these themes, you know, in films to show, you know, how inhospitable the world can become or is becoming? Would you like to go first?
Jennifer, would you like to go first or what?
Well, why don't you go first? Because I went first the last 2 times, so you go first.
Oh, okay. All right. First of all, my first intuition is like, you know, we film critic or eco critics shouldn't say a word like when it comes to creative, you know, like, and actually we are here to learn from your insights, you know, and also create a community and. I don't know. I don't know. Can I think about this a little bit more, Jennifer? Let me think about it, and you say first, okay?
I mean, I don't have any advice, obviously, but what I think is so interesting is like so many of our ideas and visions of the future of catastrophe are driven by film and media objects. I mean, this is, you know, when we imagine, and I think, you know, one thing that I find very interesting, I don't know if you guys know this, the documentary, The Anthropocene, The Human Epoch. It's Jennifer Bashwal, Nick Pensier, and Edward Berditsky. And it's a documentary that sort of takes up the thesis of the Anthropocene Working Group, and then, you know, goes around the world sort of showing us the signs of this planetary crisis. And one thing that I find really interesting about their film is like half of the stuff that they're showing me, like I don't know if I am looking, honestly, at an image of like good nature or bad nature. Like I look at this movie, I'm like, is this a good thing or is this a bad thing? And I really don't know. And like, you know, there's scenes where I'm looking at like, you know, million-year-old rock strata. So, okay, that's a kind of given thing. And then you're looking at what will later be revealed as massive topical strip mining. But it looks a lot like the rock formations from a million years ago. And one is devastation and the other is like the planet as it is. And it reminds me that like what I think I know, I mean, I don't travel all over the place. I mean, I don't know what the world looks like. What I know about the world and the crisis that we're in has come to me mostly through cinema, not even from television, but really from cinema. And that cinema really gives us our ideas about what the world looks like and how these things connect. And it's amazing to me, you know, that power that film has to do this. In particular, and this is something I wonder, I mean, you can watch these films obviously on your computer and stuff, but it's also the power of watching these things collectively with other people in a big theater, separate from the rest of the world and in that kind of artificial space. And so I think what's been interesting to me then is like, you know, this goes back to the Anthropocene film, but at one point where we're looking at an image of a vast desert. And to me, this looks like horrible desertification, because in every eco-disaster movie, the future is a desert. But there is such a thing as like a natural desert. We just, that's just not part of our imagination of what the world naturally looks like. And so I think it's not like a responsibility or anything, but I think a kind of fascination that cinema really does kind of capture our imagination of what the world looks like. And also, you know, I think it's interesting that cinema has already become an archive of what the world has looked like, of a disappearing world in ways that we can't even imagine of what cinema will be an archive of later, of what this image will come to represent. And I think we've all had this experience of like, you watch an old movie, like I was watching King of Comedy, like it's a Scorsese movie. I mean, I really like it, but there's a scene where he's like in front of a bank of phone booths, and like I was, showing the scene to my students, like what's up with these phone booths? Like who has this anymore? And the film is just all about now this kind of ecology of telephones and a kind of cityscape that doesn't exist any longer, and that was like transparent when it was being filmed, and now sort of emerges as a significant thing. So what I like about film is and it's not unique to film, but I work on film, so I think about this, is that we actually don't know how these images will signify. We don't know what their future is. We don't know how they will be read or what they will have archived, or and I like, to me, that's just the excitement of being, I mean, I'm not a filmmaker, but if I were, like, that's exciting, like, of not knowing how these images will mean what you have been taking an image of. Will the character matter, or will it be the background? Will the environment be kind of interesting to us? This kind of remains to be seen, depending on what version of us in cinema, survive. But that's me being the older person with these apocalyptic scenarios. And I totally appreciate your point that our students are not. I mean, I'm a child of the Cold War, so I went from the nuclear disaster to the Anthropocene. I'm just totally hardwired for these things. But I think you're absolutely right that our students are full of optimism. I can't figure it out, but there it is.
Okay, well, thank you for giving me some time to think about this question. And I take it back. I do think that films can do a lot. And actually, filmmakers actually play a very important role in shaping our collective imagination and providing perhaps a way, looking forward, right? How do we transform our consciousness, right? By identifying some of the problems that we want to tackle. And think about a lot of that. I'm just thinking right now in terms of documentary, not a Hollywood type of sci-fi, that turns climate change or environmental crisis into a form of consumption, right? I like to use Tsai Ming's Under the Dome as an example. It's the most watched film, right? It's in 2 weeks, I don't know, like millions of people watched it. So in terms of the spreading of environmental messages, it's actually very, very powerful, right? And people can easily, forward link and everybody watch it instantly. So our network actually does have that advantage, taking advantage of our mimetic tendency, right? And but also it has a power of change politics. I use Taiwan. There's a very touching film in Taiwan. I think it's available on YouTube. It's called 12 Nights. It's about Taiwan stray dogs. Taiwan has this kind of rampant stray dogs, and it's been a headache. It's been an issue, for Taiwan's animal activists. And sort of the group of art, this film 12 Days actually is an independent film, independent documentary, and after the release of this film, the audience was so maddened, like so angry at the way the animal were treated in animal shelters. So they pushed the politician to change the law. So filmmakers actually can use the medium, cinematic affect, sentimentality, actually, the things that we eco-critics like to criticize, but sentimentality actually works as a strategy, as an activist strategy. So I guess for me, I like to go back to the affect of compassion. As I said, that the Latin root of compassion means co-suffering. It's different from the other affect, sympathy or empathy. Sympathy still suggests a sense of you and me, a separation, right? I sympathize with your situation, but I'm still me, you're still you, right? And I think perhaps the cinema, film, a filmmaker can work on how do we dissolve this boundary of the self-other division, right? And that, I think that this kind of Cartesian self, the individuated sense of self, the scheme-bound self, right? As long as I protect, it's the very typical Hollywood sort of imagination of the self. As long as I protect myself, my family, as in the day after tomorrow, it's always saving my son, right? Or the Hollywood scenario is always saving my nuclear family. Then and it's a hero, right? I'm the hero protecting my family. As long as my family is fine, and that's defined as kind of heroic narrative. So I think independent film has that kind of liberty to go out to challenge that kind of imagination of a safety net, right? People in my safe boat, in my lifeboat, right? So and also to create a sense of compassion, not just in the sense of sympathizing other people's situation, but also understand we are also in this. You are not an outsider as an audience watching this kind of pandemic fallout, right? And then thinking about how so in that sense it's creating further distance and alienation from you and the audience, right? And this is what this specular, right? This kind of a Hollywood creates, right? You see this mega storm as somewhere out there, right? So that doesn't bring you together, But how do we imagine we are also part of this, and not only we suffer, but also we are part of the problem, And I think that's why I like the Tsai brother, and I hope that everybody has time to watch this film. Is that the Tsai brother in the end realized, oh my God, I am responsible for my mother's problem. I've been accusing my sister and brother of doing that, right? And only until the very last moment, the sister say, "Hey, you are not that innocent after all," right? And that moment of realization is powerful, right? And it can transfer into audience to think that, oh, I'm also a middle class, urban, educated, younger generation, right? And I keep accusing other people, perhaps the first world, or perhaps men, and of course that's justified. Okay, I'm not saying, but everybody should, like, to some degree, we co-suffer, and we also, co-contribute to the problem. And how do we solve the problem together? And I hope that help as a way to think about, filmmakers' role in the sort of creation of this affect of compassion.
Thank you very much for a response. Do we have time for another question? Or
I think so, yeah. We have about 10.
Do you want to ask another question?
I want to follow up with Chia-ju's, what Chia-ju just mentioned, because talking about the co-suffering, it makes me kind of think about within these relations, or the connectedness among all these, among all of us. There are people who suffer more than, some of us suffering more than others. Yeah. So how do we actually try to highlight that, and to let people know that we actually need to give more attention to the people that that needs to be helped?
Yeah, I think that's the problem. That's pretty much the problem of Latour's network ANT theory, isn't it? Right? If everything is equally distributed in terms of network actants, then who is more responsible? Then there's no theory that's perfect. And I do think it's a filmmaker's and eco-critics job, to sort of always balance, right, and contextualize and situate in, case by case, right? Like Anna Tsing's argue, like one of a very famous anthropologist, we cannot have this kind of universal theory, like Latour's network theory, and to talk about the distribution of responsibility, right, and liability, which is also very necessary, right? But on the other hand, we have to go sort of case by case. So, for example, if we're looking at Southeast Asian documentary film that talks about the suffering of women, right, whose life depends on the Mekong River, right, and of course, there is an imbalance, right? And we have to stress that. And I just thought that perhaps, without sacrificing, right? And without sacrificing the role, the important, aspect of the women, that play in the suffering of those women or working class, disfranchised peoples in the environmental crisis. But we should balance it with a more sort of diffuse way. I don't know if that is clear or not. I think we should avoid this kind of black and white either or, or either use human rights concept or use that tool. Can we sort of mix it up, and go case by case? In this case, then perhaps I don't know. So I thought I would be hesitant to have a sort of a very black and white sort of application of theory in this case.
Shall we do one last question from the audience? So
Okay.
This question is from Kiu-wai. So he's asking, this binary might be reductive. So this question is for both of you. But are there any specificities and distinctions that are worth pointing out from eco-cinemas based in a different cultural context from the global north and global south? Maybe Jennifer, you can go first, because Chia-ju just, had some to go.
Yeah, I think like her though, I also want to think about this, but I mean, I think there are a few things. I mean, I'm not expert in Asian cinemas, so it's hard for me to make any generalizations. I mean, for that matter, I don't feel like I'm an expert on cinemas of the global north either, or the global south. So I mean, that's like all world cinema. But one thing that I think is kind of interesting. So let me I can think of I'm just going to use think about two filmmakers and what I think is interesting about how they are addressing something like the Anthropocene or the epiphenomena of climate change, and also kind of questions of social justice. Like someone like Zhao Zhengke with still life, but I mean, a lot of his films are about what happened to people who are, for whom economic development, it hasn't reached their shores. They are not the winners of the new sort of Chinese economy, and they're kind of they're either at the kind of peripheral margins, either in the provinces or in the city, and kind of pushed out into the. But these are two filmmakers who I think are interested in what happens to people who were already marginalized when various forms of, whether it's building a dam or smoke burning, you're already living a fragile life when the environment becomes destabilized. And I think, Rob Nixon has done really interesting work also in talking about, developmental refugees in addition to climate refugees. I mean, the people who you can stay in place and have your home and environment sort of taken away from you. It doesn't, it's not even a matter of leaving a place, but just finding either or the place is submerged or it becomes desertification or various forms that can happen, things that can happen to you. But these are two filmmakers who I think are also rooting a kind of relationship to place around a world that I think, again, we might not want to preserve. If we start to sort of think about say questions of sustainability from the perspective of the dispossessed, it's hard to make a case that this is a world we'd want to preserve. That there's a way in which the climate crisis and it's the ways that it undoes the world or undoes the kind of global cultures, at least since 1945, and this kind of ramped up and rapacious capitalism, that maybe this is as Arundhati Roy writes about this, about the epidemic, is a kind of quick call to something like a revolution. The Anthropocene is a kind of slow burn of what could be that way, but if you're already sort of living in a disenfranchised way, at least the world is not something we would want to preserve. And I'm also kind of taking cues a little bit from, Catherine Youssef's A Billion Black Anthropocenes or None, a kind of, insurgent geography, which is sort of thinking about the way that, the political intransigence in a kind of in a global sense might need to be undone by a kind of an environmental catastrophe. And it's not like the sense that utopia is on the other side, but the idea of kind of the sentimentally clinging to something that is eroding. For many people, that world has never been there already. And so I think there's a completely different orientation. And at least I'm sure there are a lot of places where one finds it. And I don't know if this is necessarily a north-south divide, but I feel like Chia-ju Chang is very attentive to this. I think Tsai is very attentive to this. And Tsai in particular, I think there's also the way in which sort of queer futures, a different way of thinking about intimacies is underwriting all of his films too, in which one thinks about futures in a very different kind of way. It's not, as we said, focused around the child. It's focused much more in the kind of present, and when the world starts to break down, then something becomes kind of possible. I mean, I've already kind of said this in some ways, but I feel like we don't get that as much, I would say, in the cinema of the global north. I mean, we might, I'm sure there are a lot of examples, I just don't know of any. But I think that's such a big difference between like the kind of big budget Hollywood, but even like, the kind of better objects like that movie, The Anthropocene, The Human Epoch, or What an Inconvenient Truth, or Inconvenient Truth. There is a kind of sense that the Western world is a pretty good one that we want to keep. And then we move to other places and we're like, yeah, there's a lot about this world that kind of sucks. It's been bad for a lot of people. And maybe this is the breakdown we need. Maybe this is how we start to envision a radical end that couldn't come otherwise. And it's not apocalyptic. It's not super violent, but maybe this is how something new emerges. I'll stop there. I'm kind of rambling. It's getting late for me.
Well, I thank Jennifer for being the first one, so I have the time to think again. So there's a scholar whose name is James Miller, and he's a Taoist scholar. At a conference, one I also attended, he used the term either end, not either or, but either end, to sort of avoid a non-dualistic sort of tendency that compared to thinking either or, this or that, it's the way our human brain operates. So again, I use that as a way to sort of a little bit sort of deconstruct the notion of the South and the North, and at the same time, it's important. Okay, so it's just going back to my point that I was trying to make early on. So yes, this is a little bit generalized question. It actually helped me to think that how do we locate Tsai Ming Liang? Is he the North? Is he the global North? Does it belong to the global North or global South? Is Taiwan global North or global South? And and also is how different is Chia Zhang Ke's film different from Tsai Ming Liang's film in terms of their portrayal of this unspeakable suffering or trauma that is people suffered, right? So yes, and yet at the same time, the North-South difference is important. Because there's another way of characterize the North. It's called weird, Western educated, industrial, weird, rich, and democratic. Okay, so I guess I would use weird versus the non-weird. That kind of distinction is probably a better way of sort of a bracket, the differences, and if you really want to talk about the South, like how is it different from the weird nations, I would say perhaps I would use Becoming Alluvian, another film that is included in this program. It's another. So I just really breathtaking. And I don't have time to talk about this film. It's very unfortunately. Is I noticed that for films that are produced in the South, there seems to be a very rich, traditions that is sort of the filmmaker is very, very eager to incorporate their indigenous knowledge to preserve the culture, the myths, and all the history that was suppressed by colonial history. So you see the emergence of, from a post-colonial perspective, you see the emergence of both colonial narrative and the sort of pre-modern, sort of wisdom, indigenous cultures come together and to weave together into such a beautiful and heart-wrenching, story about how the beautiful South, or Southeast Asia, and are sort of destroyed, and how people is trying to restore a sense of a sense of cultural self, right? And in the age of globalization, so I think that's probably one of the most distinct characteristic that stands out to me right at this moment.
Okay. Thanks so much, Chia-ju and Jennifer. And we are running out of time at the moment, but thanks so much for all these questions and that you have left us to think about and ponder upon. So for the next session, we will actually come to at 2 p.m. We'll come back with conversations with some filmmakers. So perhaps some of these ideas that we've talked about now will be picked up by them. And so let me thank both of you, Professor Jennifer Fay and Professor Chia-ju Chang again. And thanks for joining us. And thanks everybody for listening.
Thank you. And don't forget what the film that Chia-ju was talking about, the Che Brother, is part of Mekong 2030, and it will be screened here at the Oldham Theatre as part of this series. And we'll also be talking to the film's director, NSA, later on at 2 p.m. in Singapore time. So we'll see you later.
See you soon.